Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our Beeper seminars. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. I wish I could say despite of the great weather, but that's not the case, so I won't make that joke today. So I'm really, really happy to see you. And thank you all for joining us, also to the people who are online. We are going to have a conversation today that is, of course, all-encompassing, but we'll try to narrow it down to a couple of fundamental things: democracy, war, this sort of things, right? And for those of you who have taken or are taking risk and the class on risk in international politics and economics, you already know that we tend to look a lot all the time to issues regarding risks for democracy, rule of law, and how these evolve depending on exogenous shocks. So I'm Veronica Angel. I'm a professor for risk and international politics and economics here at SAIS, among other things. And I'm really, really happy to welcome Joan Hoey today, who works for the Economist Intelligence Unit, and she's the director of the Economist's flagship annual democracy index that we already know is quite the agenda setter when it comes to policy regarding democracy and democratic backsliding in Europe and elsewhere. Joan is also a former regional director for Europe at the EIU, where she led a team of analysts covering 50 countries in Europe and Central Asia. So when we're done with all the substantive questions, you might also want to direct any kind of questions related to working in the risk industry to Joan, because she is definitely the person who has all the answers. And she has been working with the EIU since 1995 as a senior analyst for Eastern Europe. So now you know the connection here as well. Eastern Europe being one of the most important places on earth, if not the most important place, a laboratory for change. So that's definitely something that we can also discuss more at length. So I will let Joan talk for a while about the substantive issues that have also come out from their democracy index. The gist was just published last month. So she's going to do that for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we're going to have a Q&A that I hope is going to be both substantive and also industry related if you have any questions. Okay, so Joan, if that's okay with you. We'll stop this.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Hopefully everybody can hear me online too. Oh, I just brought last week's because it's got a special on Ukraine for the anniversary, so it's worth reading. Oh, I've already clicked this. Yeah, that was a special theme of this year's Democracy Index as well. Unsurprisingly, the frontline democracy and the battle for Ukraine. You know, this is a free download white paper that we do every year at the IU. So unlike about our other stuff, it's free, and all of you can go there and download it at the end. It's got the I'll show you the link, the web link. So anyway, thanks to Veronica, thanks to SAIS and John Hopkins for the invite, and thanks all of you for coming today. Time's short, so what I propose is I do this as a kind of Q&A to myself, and then that we can maybe pursue some of those questions in the discussion afterwards. So to try and, there's a lot to say, and so my answers to my very difficult questions are going to be quite schematic, you know, just because of the time. But with your participation afterwards, hopefully we can delve into some of those a bit more. And so what I wanted to address was 6 or 7 questions. The first one is to look at how global democracy is holding up, and more importantly, what we see, or what I see as the main challenges to democracy today. Then I'm going to look at the question of, are we living through a democratic recession? What's the evidence for that? As you know, that has been challenged by some democracy scholars, both in the past and even today as well. Then I want to kind of try and look a bit deeper at the underlying causes. You know, how do we explain this? Because often what we have is a discussion of the symptoms rather than the underlying causes, and the two things are kind of confused. And then I want to kind of at the end talk about why does Ukraine matter, and why 2/3 of the world is not really taking sides with Ukraine in its struggle to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And related to that, just to try and raise the question and briefly answer what went so wrong in Russia, and why did democratization fail in Russia for the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then just to conclude, you know, who's winning, and can this democracy recession be reversed? So starting with the state of global democracy, this is the results from the latest index. I think, yeah, I've got this. Might be easier for you to look at. I want to be very brief about the democracy, and there's a lot in the report. It's about 85 pages long. And so there's a kind of, it's in 3 parts. There's a kind of summary of the results. Then there's a special essay that I wrote called Why Ukraine Matters. And then there's a whole big section on all the regions, looking in detail at what's happened in all the regions of the world in 2022. Our index is a retrospective on the year just gone, so on 2022. So just very briefly, I think we can talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly for 2022. So starting with the good news is that the index score, which is on a 0 to 10 scale, I'm not going to talk about methodology, we can do that after if people want, but the index score rose for the first time in 7 years, first time since 2015. 4 of the 7 regions of the world improved their average regional score, as did 75 countries of the 167 that we cover, which was a lot more than improved in 2021 when only 47 did so. 3 countries got upgraded to full democracies. That was Chile, France, and Spain, who were kind of at the top end of the flawed democracy classification. That was mainly related to improvements, you know, related to the lifting of pandemic restrictions and curbs on individual rights, civil liberties, and so on. And several countries, quite a few countries, had big improvements in their scores. So, you know, in the report, you can see the kind of top 10 winners and also the top 10 losers in terms of the change in their index score between 21 and 2022. Thailand actually recorded the biggest improvement of any country in 2022 compared with 2021. So that's the good. What about the bad? Well, the bad news is that the index score rose, but it rose very, very modestly from 5.28 to 5.29, 5.28 in 21, 5.29 in 2022. And so that's still much below the pre-pandemic level in 2019, which was 5.44. And from the perspective of the kind of lifetime of the index from 2006 or 2008, it's not really much to write home about, because the global average score back then was about 5.55. So it's a long way from that. So over the lifetime of the index, we've seen this kind of regression in the global average score. So the story for last year is really one of stagnation rather than improvement. And that means that gains, which happened in many countries because of lifting of pandemic restrictions, curbs on movement of citizens and other things, were cancelled out by negative developments in other countries. And that's disappointing, because there was an expectation that there'd be a big rebound in the score in 2022 after 2 years of these lockdowns and all the other things that we're very familiar with, which really dented the category scores in the index for civil liberties and functioning of government. So that rebound to pre-pandemic levels didn't happen, so which suggests that a lot of negative regressive trends occurred all over the place. And the only exception to this kind of generally kind of stasis, stagnation picture was in Western Europe, where there was a rebound to pre-pandemic levels. And obviously that suggests that there was a restoration of some of these liberties that had been individual freedoms that had been suppressed during the public health emergency. And there weren't really many other big regressive trends. And actually 19 of the 21 countries in Western Europe improved their scores in 2022. That's kind of more of the bad news. And obviously the final point is that 75 countries improved their scores in the index in 2022, but that means that 92 did not, and their scores either worsened or stagnated, stayed the same. And in terms of the improvements across the regions, they were very marginal. And the regions that improved, North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, very tiny increases in their regional scores, 0.01 on this 0 to 10 scale, or 0.03 in Eastern Europe. Asia and Australasia score stayed the same in 2022 as 2021. So obviously there's a lot of movement within the regions, but they kind of cancelling each other out in terms of improvements and negative trends. So that's the good, the bad, and the ugly. That unwanted accolade goes to Russia in 2022, which was the country that recorded the biggest decline in its index score, biggest decline in the world, nearly a whole one index point. And the reasons for that is obvious, because of this unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, plus this clampdown on dissent, all dissent, and opposition to the war at home, and the kind of mobilization of state repression on an altogether, bigger scale that occurred in Russia. And I should say as well that China's score also took a beating, and from a very low level already declined further. And China persisted with the zero COVID policy throughout most of the year. And so, one thing that we saw, we didn't see an increase in the number of authoritarian regimes. It was 59 in 2022, it's 59 in 2021. But what we saw was really quite negative trends within many authoritarian regimes, not least in Russia and China. I want to talk, before I move on to talk about the democracy recession, I want to talk about the main challenges, because I think the main challenges facing global democracy are not actually, or not necessarily, the ones that everybody is talking about. And I think there is a tendency always to externalize the problem, that the problem is always over there, somewhere else. Not here, not at home. And if you think about Joe Biden's democracy versus autocracy dichotomy, kind of this framing of the problem, that suggests that the problem, is somewhere else among the authoritarian regimes. If only it were so simple. The kind of conceptualization of the problem is that it's a rise of populism, it's a rise of illiberal democracies among the non-consolidated, flawed democracies, or it was a pandemic, some external thing, or it was, or it's the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion. Now, it's not to say that these aren't problems or these aren't challenges, but they don't really tell us the whole story. The presentation of the problem in this way begs the question, why? Why is this happening? Why is there increasing support for populist parties or non-democratic alternatives around the world? And it demands an explanation, which a lot of the time we're not really hearing. And the problem with this democracy versus autocracy thesis is that it suggests that, things are rosy in the democratic camp, and it encourages a complacency about the problems at home because it focuses attention on these kind of external problems or actors. Now, that's a bit of a black and white picture because obviously there is an acknowledgement that all is not well, but there's seldom a serious attempt to get to grips with that, to investigate it. Still a reluctance to engage, to change things, to reform. To say actually that the populace might have a point, or that they're responding to a problem within the democratic camp. And why is that? I think there is a fear actually of doing so, because the problem is not easy to solve. And I think that there is a fear that among many that the problems are insoluble. So the task is so daunting that perhaps it's best to ignore it. But as we'll discuss, many of the problems do begin at home in the world's advanced democracies. And I'll talk about this now when I talk about this democracy recession point. And it takes the form of an increasingly technocratic mode of governance, which has been the case now for several decades. And, it's really become more entrenched since the end of the Cold War, since the 90s. There's a dearth of ideas, of ideological contestation. There's a demise of genuine alternatives, genuine competing political alternatives. There's a crisis of values. Instead of values, we have identity politics, which are not really values at all, but they have become a kind of organizing principle of the advanced democracies. But in short, we have a democratic deficit, and we have a democratic deficit at the national level, but also at the kind of international level as well. Which I will also talk about. And this has encouraged cynicism about democracy and a search for alternatives, and an embrace of non-democratic alternatives a lot of the time. And in the international sphere, what we see is an increasing resentment of the Western model, the Western political model, but also the Western-led international order as well. So what are the real challenges? I'm going to say very quickly. What I think the first challenge is actually the exhaustion of the Western democratic model, which is partly but not wholly linked to problems with the Western economic model and this kind of shift. I mean, this has been a long-term kind of secular decline in terms of growth over many decades in the Western world, and we've seen this shift in the economic power in the world from the West to the East, to a China-led Asia. But it's not all just about, the economics. Martin Wolf's just written a book about this, which some of you may have seen, definitely worth reading. But it's not just about that. It's also about the absence of inspiring ideas, coherent values. And instead of that, what we have is this rise in technocracy as a substitute for real engagement, genuine engagement, genuine representative democracy. So a kind of turning away from the electorate, if you like, no real contestation anymore. And the rot really set in after the end of the Cold War. So all that's linked to another problem and another challenge for democracies, which is this rise in polarization and decline in social cohesion, and this kind of culture war contestation that we see happening, not just in the US, but we see it obviously in Europe as well. And what's happening there is, on the one hand, we have this kind of new kind of consensus around identity politics, which has become a kind of organizing principle. And on the other side, in the culture wars, we have those who are holding firm to older or traditional values. And obviously that's something that democracy's enemies are seizing upon as well. You know, when Russia is always looking for problems in the Western world and divisions and so on, and trying to foment these in the kind of crudest possible way. And all these things are feeding another challenge, a decline in the prestige of the US and other Western democracies, which are no longer capable of inspiring others because they're divided within. And as I say, Russia is weaponizing this in the crudest possible way. And when the US was, you know, economically uncontested, most powerful country in the world, it was politically cohesive, it was self-confident, dynamic, it didn't need a democracy promotion agenda. It could just be itself. And, you know, it was a beacon to be emulated by others. In the post-Cold War period, we've seen this democracy promotion agenda, you know, which is was part of this unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was partly kind of imperial overreach. It was partly a desire by the US to perpetuate its hegemonic position in a changing world order, where things were much more uncertain. And of course, it's kind of wrong in principle to talk about democracy, you know, building democracy from outside anywhere. It's wrong in principle, and it was a disaster, absolute disaster in practice. And it really discredited the US and that whole kind of state building, democracy promotion agenda. I guess you could argue that to some degree the EU also exercised some kind of overreach in Eastern Europe after 1989 in this attempt to impose a kind of one-size-fits-all model on these newly liberated states in Eastern Europe, including not just a kind of you know, economic model, but also in terms of values that it tried to impose. And obviously that didn't go down too well, as we've seen over time in some places, not just in Poland and Hungary, but other places too, who kind of resented this, and it resulted in this backlash. And you know what we've seen, everybody's familiar with it. So I think those are the kind of key challenges. I think another one, just to finally, which is important because of the war in Ukraine, is a loss of belief in sovereignty, national sovereignty in a globalized world. You know, and over recent decades, this idea has grown that borders don't matter, that national sovereignty is unimportant, meaningless even in a globalized world. And you see it even now that, you know, you look at this European Council on Foreign Relations survey that just came out, which you should have a look at, very interesting, on attitudes to the war in Ukraine. Most Europeans are saying that the reason why Ukraine is important and matters and why they should support Ukraine is because the security of Europe is threatened. Well, that's maybe important, but the whole question, the kind of substantive question at the heart of this is about sovereignty and the defense of sovereignty. And I thought that survey really, you know, shows you that people don't take this seriously anymore, even though we found out last year just how important national sovereignty is. Having control of your borders, having a right to self-determination is very important, and it's the bedrock of democracy and citizenship as well. So those are the kind of more the problems as I see them. And I've probably preempted quite a lot of what I was going to say about other things. So the democracy recession, everybody's familiar with this. I'm sure Larry Diamond, US democracy scholar, coined this term and said basically we've been living through a democracy recession since 2006, so before the global financial crisis. So it's not just about that. Our democracy index, that's the lifetime of our index, actually 2006 is when it was launched, and it was partly launched in recognition of the fact that democracy was running into problems. And the reason we started it, because we were doing a lot of work on Eastern Europe, and I wrote a piece at that time called The Stillbirth of Politics, which was about Eastern Europe and why this political transition that occurred had actually led to incredible disappointment, disenchantment among people in Eastern Europe. So we launched the index, and we can talk about what it's trying to do. It's a thick measure of democracy. We're not just looking at electoral process and pluralism and civil liberties. We're looking at political participation, political culture, functioning of government. Now, the recession diagnosis is confirmed by the results of our index, and I've already talked about them. This decline in score to 5.29 today compared with 5.55. It's reflected in all the category scores over the lifetime of the index, which have all declined, and most emphatically civil liberties. The score for that has been and had the biggest decline. Electoral process and pluralism, quite a big decline, and others lesser declines, but still significant. Every region has recorded a decline in its score. So that we saw progress in many regions, we're everywhere pretty much, but especially in Europe, we saw this decline after the global financial crisis, but then there was a bit of a rebound up to 2015, but it's been kind of since then, a decline everywhere. So Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa was making progress. That's kind of been reversed in recent years. And, crucially, probably in terms of the number of democracies. So we have this classification, which is quite broad. So we have full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, and authoritarian. And that's because we see, we didn't want to repeat what was already out there, Freedom House, you're free or you're unfree. I think most people do see democracy as this continuum or a spectrum, along which you're either more democratic or less democratic, or more authoritarian or less. So we have this hybrid regime category, which, is scores between 4.0 and up to 6.0. So there's many countries scoring 5 and above, between 5 and 6. They have many elements of democracy, but more serious flaws than countries in the flawed democracy category. So, it's not an either or question. But nevertheless, if we want to measure the number of democracies that we classify as full or flawed, it's gone down by 10 since 2006. So it's gone down from 82 back in 2006, I think it was, or 2008, down to 72. So on all those counts, the democracy recession question stands. And the one exception, which is a challenge to this democracy decline thesis, is in political participation, is the one category that has made, significant improvement over the lifetime of the index. And so the score, the kind of category score, that's an average category score across all countries, has risen from 4.59 to 5.44. That's quite a big increase, nearly 0.85 points on this scale. And that's a striking result. It's not universally seen as a good thing, is it? Because part of that's associated with this upsurge of populism and also political protest in the developing world as well, in Africa, in Latin America, also in the Middle East and North Africa. And some have seriously argued, including academics, that increased popular participation in politics, as reflected in the rise of populist forces, is not an anti-establishment, anti-systemic movements. It's been bad for democracy. That's not the way I would interpret this phenomenon at all. Our interpretation would be that this is a reaction to the shortcomings of the kind of actually existing models of democracy in not just in the mature democracies, but in many of these non-consolidated democracies as well. So it's a demand essentially for more representation, accountability, and it's resulted in more competition between old and new parties. It's opened up the political arena to more debate and contestation over ideas and policies. I'm not going to talk more about the main symptoms, because I think I've already said big decline in civil liberties. A lot of that has to do with basically erosion of free speech, freedom of expression, and not only in authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes, but in the advanced democracies as well. And again, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, free media, those are really fundamental to democracy. We've seen erosion in another category of electoral process and pluralism, which has mainly taken place in non-consolidated democracies, in the flawed democracies and hybrid regimes. And obviously that's also a sine qua non of democracy, that you have a competitive political landscape, pluralism, and free and fair elections. It's not everything, but it's pretty fundamental. And then in functioning of government, one of the kind of key drivers of that decline is decline in trust in government, in political parties, in institutions, which is, really significant. This kind of long secular decline that we've seen in trust in institutions in the US, but it's mirrored in other countries as well, in France, in different places in Europe. And in political culture, what we see as a result of all this is that people's attachment to democracy is weakening. Now, all the global surveys, Pew, Gallup, World Values Survey, what they show is that globally there is still, people still have a strong attachment to and belief in democracy in general, but what they do not, or what they're disenchanted with, is the state of democracy in their own countries, that it's not working for them, and that's driving a decline in our political culture category. So there's much more readiness to embrace non-democratic alternatives, so strong rule by strongmen, rule by technocrats, populist alternatives, and so on. So people are turning away from democracy to embrace these non-democratic alternatives out of frustration with the way things are. And other polls by Pew and others show that, what there is a demand for, and it's incredibly very high levels in Europe, many countries in Europe, including Italy and Spain and Greece, is for political reform, root and branch political reform of the political systems. And it's not really happening. So moving on, the drivers. Well, I mean, I've talked about why our index has declined, what are the, in terms of the category scores. I'm going to finish talking about Ukraine now. But I think we can even try and push things a bit further. Maybe that's something that we can do in the discussion. I think it can be difficult to separate sometimes the kind of symptoms from the causes. A lot of the time, what we see as an explanation is the kind of economic driver, which is, I guess, at the core of Martin Wolf's book. But I mean, it's not so crude as just to say it's all about, is the economy stupid? Or he has that title in one of his chapters. But I mean, essentially, that is what he is saying. And he's not just saying it's about, that the advanced economies and haven't delivered. And this has led to, disenchantment, opposition to globalization. It's a lot about growth of income inequalities, social inequalities, the kind of creation in the end of a kind of, some have called it an oligarchic class, versus massive ordinary people who have not really been beneficiaries, or don't feel anyway that they have been beneficiaries of this trend. I mean, it might be easier to make a case for the positive benefits of globalization in other countries, developing countries, than it is in the advanced democracies. But, that's part of the explanation. But I don't think it's a sufficient one. And I've talked about some of the political drivers of discontent, this kind of growth of this technocratic model that has bred disenchantment. But I think there's others. So we can talk maybe about geopolitics and how that has really changed things. And geopolitics has always played a very big role in terms of influencing the balance of political forces in the world. And what we've seen is a very big change, from the Cold War era to post-Cold War era, breakdown of this the post Second World War international order since 1990, the waning preeminence of the US, the rise of China, the return of Russia to the international stage, the increasing economic importance and weight of many developing countries now, which are able to play much more of a role today than they were during the Cold War era, this kind of bipolar era. So we are in this multipolar order, and it's inevitable, really, that that's going to influence attitudes towards power, towards the Western political model. And as we'll see over Ukraine, it's led to, in the developing world, a lot of resentment against the West, because the political institutions that run the world today are essentially the ones that were established after the Second World War. And they haven't changed. The world has changed and moved on, but there's been a reluctance on the part of the great powers who made that order to change anything and to integrate other powers into these political arrangements. And as long as that's the case, the West is going to have a massive problem winning the argument on Ukraine and many other things with the developing world. I could say other things. I'll just throw them out. End of the kind of third wave. You know, was there always going to be a limit to that after the opening up of Eastern Europe and the countries in Africa that wanted to democratize? Are we now just left with, very difficult cases, hard nuts, which are always going to be very difficult for things to change? I talked about the discrediting of the democracy promotion agenda. I think that's had an impact. The experience of external intervention. What happened in the Middle East? I think with Iraq and the kind of disintegration that ensued, rise of Islamist insurgencies and so on, really made it much more difficult to have positive homegrown change in that region. Experience of political transition in places in Eastern Europe and Africa has been deeply disappointing, and the failure of the Arab Spring, the failure of color revolutions in the CIS countries, that's all been kind of to bred cynicism or disenchantment about the prospects for change. So just to finish off, just about Ukraine and why Ukraine matters. I think it's very simple, and I've kind of said it already. Sovereignty is a bedrock of democracy, something that every Democrat should defend, both out of on principle, but also out of self-interest. And without sovereignty, none of us can have freedom or democracy or any kind of meaningful citizenship. And if we allow that to be trampled on in Ukraine, we're not going to be able to defend it anywhere. And that's why developing countries, which are not taking sides in this war, but really hold dear this principle of sovereignty, should actually be taking sides with Ukraine as well. But instead, we have this kind of, what about what the West did? What about what the US did, intervening in the sovereign affairs of other countries? But that's all true. But this argument of precedent, it's kind of just, in the end, it's sophistry to say that, well, they did it, so we don't care about what Russia's doing. Either you believe in sovereignty or you don't, and you defend it or you don't. And obviously Russia used that argument in the past, completely lost the moral high ground on that argument back in 2014 when it annexed Crimea and launched its war in the Donbass. So we can talk maybe a bit more about that. I'm not going to talk about Russia and what happened in Russia. Maybe we can leave that for the discussion, because I think I've talked too long. And so this is a map that we did showing how the world is lining up in terms of the war in Ukraine. And so you see the Russia-leaning countries in the deeper red, neutral in the kind of more orangey and west leaning in the kind of palest pink colors there. It's an exercise. We're updating it now, you know, a year since the war started, and will be published again. Probably see it in the Economist as well. This is something that our EIU analysts have done, and actually some things have got worse. You know, if you look at the change in South Africa's position, for example, you know, which had condemned the invasion and is now, you know, taking a kind of pro-Russia position, carrying out exercises with Russia. So lots to talk about here, and what this all means, I think, for future. And as I said, we can talk about Russia and what went wrong and how it all came to this in the discussion, if there's interest in doing that. And we can also talk about, you know, whether the contest is still open and things can be improved. And that's where you can download the report. Thank you. Thank you, Joan. We're going to leave this for a second there.
Thank you so much. That's a lot to talk about. I'll just ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor, and I'll be brief. I've numbered the questions that I would want to ask you, but we have more time for that. I'm going to build up on this, my first question on this map that you pointed to here, and connect it to something that you said that's very interesting. So you said several times that this idea of building democracy as an is an absolute disaster as a strategy that has been discredited by the outcomes and so on, versus something that, if I understand correctly, you would point out to be as the better option, which is allowing democracy to self-promote in a way that there was a time when democracy could it was self-explanatory that it's the better option. And the people right now are rather setting up the world in this form of democracy versus autocracy. And when you look at this map and you think in terms of who's on Ukraine's side, so on the side of sovereignty, but also maybe current world order or so on, you do see that there is a split. And the split would also overlap what you would consider to be a full democracy, more or less, in your index, and not that great a democracy in the other categories, hybrid regimes, authoritarian regimes. So in a way, it still seems that there is something to this idea of the world being divided in terms of how to support democracy or not. And I feel that you are right that we should unpack that. And there's multiple causes why these countries support maybe Russia, or they're just not, or they're just neutral. So it's not just one idea that led to this. But when you think about this idea that democracy would be self-promoting, I wonder if that is the case, and if that indeed the demands that we have of these man-made systems that you've pointed out to as well shouldn't be the demands that we have of the men who made them as well. So basing ourselves too much on what citizens want or believe to be the best choice for themselves wouldn't be another detrimental thing to do to democracy, which is in fact let me put it this way, so to actually have a question there. The idea, is it the idea of democracy, the way we look at it, that is problematic, or the way that it is being pushed or shaped? So is there something substantively wrong with it, or is it the way that it has been presented and pushed on people that weren't maybe ready or are just incompatible with this model that we have to take into account? Because those two things are not the same.
Do I have to use this?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, just a few quick points. So I think the way the world is lining up, as you see on this map, the way the world is lining up on the war in Ukraine reveals a different divide than democracy versus autocracy. It's actually one between the West and the rest, or between the North and the South. And that includes, on the other side, many countries which we would classify as democracies, either flawed democracies, non-consolidated democracies, whatever you want to call them, including hybrid regimes, and in that classification, ones that have more elements of democracy than others. So the ones between 5 and 6 in our index that score that. So it's not this neat, democracy versus autocracy divide. So we need to discuss why that is and what is driving it. So just leaving that aside for a minute. Now, on the question of models, I don't believe in models of democracy. I don't think there is one kind of one size fits all, no model, some perfect model. In the end, it's up to every country, to find their own way to democracy, and that country's history, all these, historical legacies, will play a part in shaping that. That country's culture, all sorts of things, level of economic development will shape, the sort of democracy that evolves there. Now, you can say that, you can identify core things that are necessary to at least formally have a democracy. And, I think that's clear to everybody that you need, free and fair elections, you need political pluralism and kind of open, political field and pluralism. You need civil liberties. And that's the kind of, you need freedom of expression, you need free speech. That's absolutely essential. So those are the building blocks. And you see in many non-consolidated democracies, these kind of formal attributes of democracy are there, but the kind of what makes democracy more substantive, many elements of that are lacking. And the thing is that democracy is very hard to build, and it requires massive effort and endeavor. And it certainly requires political participation, willing, voluntary political participation. There's certain, requirements of, in terms of political culture as well that are important, and it needs a functioning state, and functioning government. And, what we see in many non-consolidated democracies is a kind of lack of state capacity for one reason or another. That in terms of that kind of transition paradigm discussion about Eastern Europe, which is where I would agree with some of the critics of the democracy recession, the Carruthers, critique of the transition paradigm was correct, that, what was ignored there, there was this idea, it was this teleological vision that, there was an opening, there was an elite-led thing, and countries were on this kind of linear, transition path from whatever they were to democracy. And that, obviously, that's not the way it worked. And what that kind of paradigm left out was all these important things about history, historical legacies, institutional legacies. I mean, who was it who said, the past is not dead, it's not even past? It was a novelist. I can't remember who it was now. And, that's really true, that Russia, look at Russia, historical, political, institutional legacies really matter a lot. State capacity matters a lot. And these are all the things that were really ignored. So if you had this kind of idea that this was how things were going to happen in this kind of, just static model or linear kind of model, so you had these unrealistic expectations of what was going to happen. And then when they're confounded, you have this overly pessimistic interpretation of what went wrong in the democracy recession. Now, I think it was easier to contest the democracy recession, some time ago. I think it's very difficult to do so now. And we never bought into that kind of paradigm, transition paradigm anyway. you know, and you can see from our index that we think all these things are very important. You know, it's not just about electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, all these other things, you know, really matter a lot, and they're going to shape, you know, the political development of any country. So there's no model, and I think we shouldn't try to impose it. I think it's a contradiction in terms to talk about democracy promotion, because in the end, it's about sovereignty, and you know, that's the basis of, you know, whether you're talking about national sovereignty or individual sovereignty, individual autonomy. It's up to citizens in any given place, you know, to decide what political arrangements they want to have and how free or less free they want their society to be. So to try and impose some particular model on another country is fundamentally anti-democratic. Now, that's, I'll stop there because there's
I just continue on the same idea, and it also connects to a quick discussion that we could have on the index itself, which is in certain ways a model, because it creates these categories, and it tells you how you should look like if you would like to be a democracy, and then you spread it evenly across the world. So it must be hard for you to keep all these into the same box in a way, to think that everything should be tailor-made, but then create these 4 categories and try to stick everything in them. So the idea behind these models, and this is why it's also very important, how do we use them? So how do we use the democracy index that you guys put together? Also because looking at it, we would like to also anticipate trends, right? So this is what we are working with here a lot. And when we say we don't want to promote, maybe it's not a good idea to promote democracy, but we do use these indexes as points of intervention. So where is a country lagging behind? Is there anything that we could do to intervene? Either us or civil society on the ground in those countries, so us from the outside or in those countries themselves, where should they work harder to increase these things that in the end serve the common good, not just the state. So how do you recommend would be a best practice use of this index if it's not a model for democracy?
I don't recommend a use in that sense. I mean, we're not in the business of democracy promotion in that sense. You know, there is what we're trying to. I guess it's like, you know, this critique of, you know, why are you doing this? Well, I think it's useful. I think it's useful to you know, first of all, try and conceptualize democracy. Now, there's always going to be disagreement. People are going to have different concepts of democracy, and the difference between ours and others is that it's this kind of wider measure, thick measure, rather than a thin one. We're not just repeating, looking at this kind of in this narrow way, the kind of mainstays, if you like. You know, we think that these other things are very important, and particularly political participation, which nobody really else looks at. We also think that you know, our functioning of government category is important. That's really looking at you know, state capacity, but it's also looking at the degree to which you know, the state allows citizens to have a role in determining their own future as well. So first, it's useful to have a debate about democracy and, you know, conceptualization. People say about economic forecasting, you know, everybody gets it wrong all the time, but it's still worth doing. You know, it's still worth, you know, trying to, you know, create a framework to understand the economy, or understand the world, or understand the state of democracy, you know, and trying to measure, you know, what is going wrong. And we're doing that not because, you know, actually we're completely independent. We're not funded by anybody. We don't have any interaction with governments who obviously look at this. We don't respond to them. it's pretty clear, where the, weaknesses might be. So if you want to address them, do something about it. That's not our business. We don't have any, we follow up in that sense. We're not foisting this, any model on anybody. All we're trying to do is contribute to a discussion about how we understand democracy, and to look at trends in the world and identify, some of the problems. And out of that, hopefully, we can have discussions like, we're having today. And then it's up to governments or other actors, citizens in any country, to do their own thing. So yeah, this is not some kind of economist model that we're trying to foist on anybody or any government. And we don't take any money from anybody for this. And then, something that we do internally, it's our country analysts who do the scoring and so on. So that's what I would say about it. I think it's it's quite a useful thing to do.
I think it's people are using it for different purposes. So I'm definitely sure you're aware that people are using it to, even in the European Parliament, to make a claim about, for example, how Hungary should look like, and it doesn't. And so it's a very powerful tool. So whether you want it or not, it is setting an agenda of how democracy should look like. Let's have some questions from the audience. And I have Mame, Rebecca. Okay, we'll have, should we take them in threes? Is that okay?
Yeah, take a bunch of questions. I can stop talking for a while.
Oh, we have Mame first, and then Rebecca, and then Chris.
I would like to ask, do you think democracies are inherently fragile or they are inherently resilient? And why do you think either?
Okay.
And then my question had more to do with the kind of methodology of the index, and specifically the defining of what is a full democracy, and is that purely based off of what's going on domestically? Does it take into account kind of, I'm thinking in the case of France, its relationships with its past colonies and how those are a bit very imperialistic in nature, not necessarily democratic at all. And so what does that look like in defining what is a full democracy?
Thank you, Rebecca. Chris.
Thank you for the interesting talk. First of all, my name is Chris. What I found very interesting is something that you said earlier, is that democracy index has declined over the years that you've used it. But one of the factors, the political participation, has actually increased. You said it was partly due to more protesting, but also more participation. And then after that, you noted some of the surveys that were out now that indicated that overall, in most countries, people still believe in democracy, but they're not happy with their own democracy. So those contrast, in my opinion. So I feel like how do you rhyme the increase in participation with the decline in how happy people are with their democracies? And I guess my follow-up question would be like, can free speech decline whilst political participation improves?
Should we take these and then get another two? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I can say something about the methodology. And if you download the report, there's a whole section at the back which is has a discussion about our model, that methodology, all the indicators are set out there, and our approach to it, and how we conceived it. Now, so obviously we are trying to provide a snapshot of the state of democracy in all these countries that cover, which is basically the most of the world, and more or less the entire population of the world. And the way it works, it's an index that's on a 0 to 10 scale, and it's based on scores across 60 indicators spread across these 5 categories that I talked about. So for electoral process and pluralism, it's about 12 indicators, functioning government, about 14. And so all those categories, civil liberties has probably got the most indicators of all. And then each category has a rating on a 0 to 10 scale. And that's based on the sum of the indicators in the category, and they're converted to a 0 to 10 scale. And then the overall index for each country is a simple average of these 5 category scores, so across these 60 indicators. And then we do this classification based on the scores on countries' total scores. So full democracies are countries with a score greater than 8, and across all these categories. Flawed democracies are countries with score greater than 6 and equal to or less than 8. And then we have hybrid regimes, the same between 4 and 6, and authoritarian regime scores less than or equal to 4. So, as I said, this is this kind of thicker measure, and I've probably said enough about that. And so it's pretty obvious that the kind of full democracies are ones that are scoring quite highly across most categories. I've actually got here, this is what's happened with the kind of globally with all, and I've got it by region as well, with all the category scores since the beginning of the index. So, you know, just so you know that and I guess you, what do you think is the highest scoring category globally out of these 5 categories? Which one do you think would score highest? So to remind you, electoral process pluralism, functioning of government, civil liberties, political culture, political participation, which you think would have globally the highest score? Electoral process and pluralism, you know, because that's a kind of pretty formal. That's got the highest score, although it's, as I said, it's kind of after civil liberties, it's declined quite a lot, and it's been eroded, and those things have been eroded, formal things, elements of electoral process declined quite a lot in the mainly non-consolidated, obviously don't really exist in authoritarian regimes, even formal freedoms there, but in the hybrid and non-consolidated, whereas the full democracies generally tend to score very highly in that category. Not perfect, of course, because there's elements like funding of political parties, which are a perennial problem. But that's the highest scoring category. The next one is political participation, as you suggested. And that's gone up a lot. And so maybe I can answer that question now that you raise. And is there a contradiction between the kind of decline of free speech and rise of political participation? Interesting questions. You know, I think that what we've seen, so the problems that I described of, especially in the advanced democracies, this kind of growing trend towards this model of governance that is that's based on technocracy, based on excluding the public. That's what's happened. Now, there was always an element of that in democracy from the beginning of the 20th century. You know, it's for political elites, the problem of how to deal with the problem of the public once the masses enter politics, you know, and the working class becomes a political actor at the beginning of the 20th century. That is the big problem that is posed. How do you integrate? How do you deal with class conflict? You know, that problem has now changed since the end of the Cold War to a large degree, but it's still there because we live in a capitalist system which is fundamentally, you know, has inequalities. And so there's always going to be contention there. But so the question is, how do you deal with that? And the way that most developed democracies dealt with that was by integrating the working class and its political representation, political organizations into the system. But, you know, via political parties, Labour, social democratic parties, and trade unions. But there was always a degree to which there was a limitation on that. So, and it took different forms. So a lot of power given to non-democratic or non-representative institutions, judiciary and so on. So in a way to keep control and to limit the degree to which that element could cause a disruption. So it was always to some degree circumscribed. But nevertheless, we lived through this era of representative democracy, and an era also where we had, contending political forces based on alternative views of how to organize the world, between kind of more left, communist, social democratic, alternative, and more conservative, Christian democratic, right? And that contestation persisted through the post Cold War, through the Cold War period. It kind of started to shrivel up basically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the left had already been discredited in many places, and so that whole problem of how to deal with the opposition, the working class, or anti-systemic forces, that whole question changed after that. And it also meant that parties lost their kind of identity as well. All that kind of ideological baggage, fell away. And, one of the problems that parties have grappled with is, what do they stand for now? And it's not just parties, it's institutions. What do institutions of the advanced democracy stand for these days? And so the idea that this was going to be a triumph of kind of the Western model after the collapse of the Soviet Union hasn't proved to be the case at all. In fact, it's actually created lots of problems. But what we've seen, instead of representative democracy, is what this kind of technocratic model. And so what characterized a lot of the democracies for a long time was abstention and non-participation. I mean, that's why the UK was generally so low down in the democracy index. The US has a big problem with participation and electoral turnout and so on. And that's changed quite a lot. And that's because in a modern society where people, take for granted formal rights and freedoms and civil liberties and participation, it's unsustainable. You can't run a system on that basis of excluding the majority of people from playing a real role, because at the end of the day, people want their views to be heard. People want their interests to be represented. And if they're not anymore by the kind of political parties that are running the show, which haven't really changed that much, then they're going to look for representation elsewhere. And that's what happened. It's happened, across the developing world, where people are dissatisfied with those in power. And we had, upsurge of protests and demands for more, better representation across Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And in the West, the form it took was this kind of rise of populist insurgencies. And that's my interpretation of what's happened. So a challenge to this kind of model that wasn't really working for people, and it was unsustainable. And yeah, I'm afraid that it's coincided with increasingly kind of attacks on freedom of speech, the idea, and media freedoms. And that's not just happened in the kind of authoritarian world. It's happened in the developed democracies as well. But, the idea that there should be constraints on freedom of speech. There are some things that shouldn't be said. Well, it's a controversial topic, but, again, I do believe in freedom of speech, but we don't.
So probably here an idea would be that as political participation increased, people had to adjust expectations about how democracy works, as they saw how it actually works, and how difficult it is to balance everything that democracy would mean. And so their dissatisfaction with democracy decreased because the expectations were so high. That could be one of the explanations that I've seen in some of the papers in my profession. There was another question about whether you think democracy is inherently fragile, or that if it has inbuilt mechanisms to resist once it's set, but probably you've answered that already, that there is nothing to democracy that makes it self-sustaining. Have to fight for it, right? So that was
I didn't address it directly, but it's a good way to think about it. It's a good question. That people over the course of more than a century have had to fight for their rights, for civil liberties, at great cost, and are still doing so today in Iran and other places. Nothing is handed down, and nothing has been handed down by the people who are running the show. Any gains that have been made by ordinary people being prepared to fight for those rights. So yes, they can always be taken away if we don't defend them and if we're not vigilant. So I think probably there is this kind of underlying fragility there. Resilient, you can say that some are more resilient, those countries at the top of the democracy index, which happen to be a lot of the Nordic countries and a few others, where things actually work quite well. So people, there's a correlation there with life satisfaction, what people are satisfied, because the system is actually, seen to be more fair, more equal, works quite well. You have a very well-functioning state and so on, and all these kind of elements, that are important, operate quite well. It's in the places where they're not, where you don't have, where you have elites, that, corruption, where you have patronage systems and so on, where people are very, very dissatisfied.
So it's either fragile or resilient, depending on the conditions on the ground. Claudio, and then, okay. So we're going to have to gather a few more and keep it maybe shorter. Claudio.
Also from my side, thank you very much for the very instructive presentation. My question is related to something you highlighted before. You said that the dropping of the pandemic measures had a positive impact on the index, even if ever so slightly. My question relates to the Ukraine war. Can we expect there to be a positive or negative trend due to the war? Thank you.
So effects of the war next to you.
Yeah, I was wondering, Emily. Sorry, I didn't see you. Sorry.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. Thank you very much. I kind of have two questions, but I'm going to fit them into one. So my first thought was following what you talked about, no one model, one fits all model, being the case for democracy. I wanted to understand, how does the democracy index then acknowledge different types of democracy? And then this follow-on question to that is, since the inception, have you had any iterations to the categories, either excluding some or adding some on? Thank you.
So if countries have changed categories or what?
No.
I think more, should we add any indicators or even a whole new category?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering how you assess the overall impact of social media on democracies on a global level, whether it's like rather providing a good platform to have free speech, or whether it's like really having the effect of building filter bubbles and thus undermining democracy.
Can you tell me your name? We haven't met.
Peter.
Peter. Okay. Peter in front of you, Desmond.
I had two questions. The first one was related to, you mentioned that the international system is more multipolar now, and that there's a general trend of democratic recession. I was wondering if there's a relationship between the two. And my second one has to do with this graph. Do you think the divide in the international system in regards to like you talked about like the respect for sovereignty. Do you think this divide would have any influence on the general trend of like democracy as a whole, either with like the recovery of it or with like the recession of it?
So countries' reaction to the war as causes for more or less democracy. That's okay. Should we answer these? Maybe.
Yeah,
we
there's
should
a
try
few
to shorten
related,
so we can get
yeah.
Another.
Sure, I'm happy to carry on the discussion even if people want to. Yeah, so a few questions there about Ukraine impact and this kind of divide that we see on the map. So to try and talk about that. So yeah, so I said that, you know, so the divide doesn't mirror this kind of democracy, autocracy. There's a lot of countries in there that are in our index are classified as flawed democracies or hybrid regimes, or even full democracies, probably not really wanting to line up behind the Western position on this. And yes, I think yeah, what's going on here is that we're seeing these major geopolitical changes that are having an impact on the balance of power in the world and calling into question the Western-dominated international order that's prevailed since the Second World War. Now, this shift doesn't necessarily equate with a shift away from democracy and towards autocracy, although we can see that China's influence in the world, you know, is rising, you know, in particular places. We can see that Russia is trying, even though it's, you know, by comparison doesn't have that much to offer others, but nevertheless, it's been working very hard diplomatically. We saw it in the pandemic as well, the role that these two powers played in trying to win friends and influence in parts of the developing world. And we look today at what's going on in not only in Africa but in Latin America. They are investing a lot of resources, and they are actually encountering quite a ready audience. Now, why is that? Oh, I talked already about how this kind of reluctance to change anything has bred resentment. I mean, obviously, that's the kind of what we hear all the time from China and Russia, you know, but it's also a view that's shared by many developing countries as well. And the point is that most developing countries do not see things the same way as the West. Actually, they see this as Europe's war, you know, not their concern. The question they ask, and we hear it often from India, representatives of the Indian political establishment, but why do Europe's problems become global problems that demand sacrifice from everyone else, all of us? But when the developing world has a problem, these are seen as local calamities and not really anything doesn't happen. So I think, yes, Veronica, you're right that their reluctance to line up behind the Western position reflects various things. Number one, frustration with the established international order and the emphasis on first world issues, resentment of perceived Western hypocrisy in light of past Western intervention in their affairs, dependency to some degree on resources, you know, Russian minerals and other resources, or you know, the promise of cheaper access to them. And people have mentioned the kind of past, you know, colonial relationships. Obviously, that kind of persists, and Russia plays upon that too, and the role of the Soviet Union in supporting various, you know, anti-colonial movements, national liberation movements in various continents around the world. You know, you can see that kind of legacy of the non-aligned past, you know, in a way we're having a kind of reconstitution, a kind of new non-aligned moment, you know, where countries do not want to take sides, even if they don't like what's happening and they condemn the invasion, you know, they're not going to be outspoken about it. So
you know, sorry, didn't want to interrupt. And it sounds that so Joan doesn't want to forecast, right? So the how will this look like in the future? Although the questions in a way were pointing at that. So what are the effects of this war? And it sounds to me like you're saying that the war will breed more resentment towards, could breed more resentment towards the West, and thus with any model of governance associated with the West. So it's likely that we will see support for what we measure as democracy according to these indicators go down. Do I understand that?
Well, I think, yeah, I think we've had 30 years in which nothing much has changed in terms of those attitudes. I mean, you can't forever talk about the colonial past. I'm not saying it's not important, but, you know, we have times of change. And, but, you know, what we see is that the West has really not in 30 years managed to shift the dial, change the argument, win the kind of moral argument. And what are the reasons for that? I think it's not just about these kind of legacies of the past. I think it's also about the kind of declining influence and prestige of the US and the West in general, and obviously the rise of other powers, particularly China, but also the rise of other developing countries which have much more clout now and, you know, and times have changed. We are in a multipolar world. So, you know, they count for something. And the US cannot boss everybody around again. So I think the West has not been making the arguments. And obviously it's hard for the West to win this sovereignty argument, because it's true to some degree, well, to a large degree, that the West has not exactly upheld that principle of non-intervention and sovereignty itself, both during the Cold War and during the post-Cold War period. It's invaded other countries. It's launched interventions under various, with various justifications, you know, in Somalia, in Libya, in the Middle East, in Yugoslavia. And so this is the perennial argument. What I'm saying is that actually, if, you know, out of self-interest, developing countries which believe in sovereignty, and their own sovereignty is being challenged in many places at the moment, in Africa, in Latin America, by state and non-state actors, have an interest in upholding the principle of national sovereignty and not making excuses for what Russia is doing. And just because the West has violated this principle in the past is no reason, to not to uphold the principle in relation to the war in Ukraine. It's just for reasons, not just principle, but self-interest. Because in Africa, we can see what China is doing, not just in Africa, in Eastern Europe too. And at some point, that will undermine the sovereignty of it's already doing so, of those countries. In Latin America, we have non-state actors, you know, drug traffickers and so on, who are basically a law unto themselves and challenging, undermining the authority and legitimacy of the state. So there's many challenges, hybrid warfare, other things as well.
So just whether you have a quick answer to, have you ever considered enlarging the categories, so different types of democracy? And could that be a sentence or?
Yeah, the sentence. Well, we always review what we're doing in light of, you know, what's happening in the world and developments. Every year we have a kind of review of everything. And yeah, we have considered adding countries. That's a kind of difficult thing, because countries that were excluded in the beginning because they are war-torn, data poor, whatever, might be a case for including them. And obviously it makes it more difficult to do in terms of the comparisons, you know, index scores and historical comparisons. In terms of adding indicators, I guess the social media thing comes in here.
And the colonialism, so the idea of extending the theoretical base of adding more indicators.
Yeah, I think, well, the thing is, I think that most of these things are covered. So we have quite a lot of questions on freedom of expression, media freedom, and so on. So the whole, you know, rise of, you know, alternative of social media is kind of encompassed by those questions. So we haven't added indicators. I don't think there's a case for a new category. I think ours is wide enough. Some people might argue, you know, you don't consider economic inequalities, but ours is a model of political democracy. We're not looking at, you know, economic models here. So that's discussed in the methodology at the back. Yeah, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think our methodology is pretty robust and good. And obviously, you know, what can change is guidance, you know, in terms of answering the questions. I mean, as to, you know, the question of, you know, colonialism and so on, we do have questions that pertain to history of independent statehood, control of territory, things like this. So the 60 indicators is quite a lot. I think Freedom House and its 2 index is of political freedoms and civil liberties has 25 in total. So it covers, our index covers a lot of ground, and yeah, I would encourage you to look at the question. If you have things that you think are missing, I'd really like to hear from you.
So unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, but I will abuse my role as moderator and give a nod to my profession. In political science, we have hundreds of indicators, and we're fighting over every tiny bit of nuance that we can make a name for ourselves out of. So that we do have many, many indicators in other indexes. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining. So happy to see many of you who I haven't seen in a while. Please join me in thanking Joan for her lecture and for coming to give it to us today. Thanks.
My pleasure.
We didn't get a chance to talk, and thank you to the people online for sticking with us. You didn't have questions, but we didn't have a chance to talk about the risk industry. But we'll have to just get you back here for another conversation on that. You can download it. It's free.
Yeah.
And it's yes, we have